That night, the whole rescue center went silent as a singed little lion cub, fresh from a wildfire, stumbled to the feet of an old lion who'd been beaten so long he didn't dare roar anymore. One swipe of that paw and the baby would be gone. But instead of turning away, the silent lion lowered his head, and in that split second, an orphaned child chose a broken soul to be his father. The sun was sliding down behind the red hills when they brought the cub out. Evening in the New Mexico high desert always looked gentle from a distance, all soft pink sky and long shadows. But inside the fences of High Desert Refuge, the air felt tight, like the whole place was holding its breath. Dust floated in the light. Somewhere far off, a semi rolled along the highway, the low hum barely reaching the refuge. In the center enclosure, a Len sat as still as a stone. His name was Mason. Up close you could see the age in him, though he was not old in years. His paws were huge, his shoulders broad, his mane thick but dulled, streaked with a tired, dry gold. What betrayed him were his eyes. They were the eyes of someone who had learned that nothing good came from making a sound. Mason did not pace. He did not roar at the distant trucks or at the vultures circling the hills. He simply sat near the middle of the enclosure, always facing the same worn patch of fence, as if waiting for a door that never opened. The staff had long stopped expecting anything dramatic from him. He ate enough to live. He moved enough to keep his joints from freezing. He was, in every way that mattered, a lion who no longer roared. The gate on the far side of the enclosure creaked open. Dr. Grace Miller stepped through, cradling a bundle of tawny fur against her chest. She moved carefully, the way you move when your hands are full of something fragile, and the world has turned suddenly clumsy around you. The wind tugged at her ponytail and at the hem of her jacket, but she kept her arms steady. Behind the safety glass of the viewing shed, Ethan Cole watched with his hands braced on the rail. On the monitor in front of him, the camera zoomed in, tracking Grace's every step. Next to him, Maria Lopez had one thumb hovering over the gate release button and the other hand curled around a styrofoam cup of coffee, gone cold. "That's close enough," Ethan murmured into the radio. Grace heard the crackle in her earpiece and stopped where the sandy ground dipped slightly. 3 long strides away, Mason sat, his massive head turned just enough to see her without seeming to care. The evening light caught the scar along his muzzle, a pale line from another life. Grace looked from the lion to the cub in her arms. The tiny body twitched, legs paddling at air, eyes still a little glassy from the medicine and the long afternoon. Finn, they had named him after a leaf that clung to a burned tree outside the fire line. He weighed barely more than a bag of sugar. His heartbeat fluttered against her, hands like a bird. "You ready, little man?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. In the viewing shed, Donna Briggs stood just inside the door, arms folded tight, a clipboard pressed to her chest like a shield. Donna dealt in budgets and liability. She worried about medical bills, insurance forms, and the kind of lawsuits that could sink a refuge like this faster than rising healthcare costs, could empty a retirement account. She did not like this plan. She did not like any plan that relied on miracles. "Remember," she said quietly, mostly to Ethan, "if this goes wrong, there's no undo button, no disability benefits for either of them." Ethan didn't look away from the lion and the woman and the cub on the screen. "If we do nothing," he answered, "it goes wrong anyway." Out in the enclosure, Grace knelt. Sand pressed through the knees of her jeans. The smell of lion, warm, musky, heavy with old straw and sun-baked earth, rose around her. Mason's ears twitched once, the only sign that he noticed anything at all. Very slowly, Grace lowered the cub to the ground. Finn's paws met the cool sand and splayed out, his legs too weak to hold him. For a second, he simply lay there, sides heaving. The world must have been enormous and confusing from where he lay, a sky too big, air that smelled of strange animals, a looming shape of gold and muscle that his young brain nevertheless recognized from somewhere deep in his blood. Mason watched. His nostrils flared as the new scent reached him: milk, smoke, antiseptic, and underneath it all the thin, sharp smell of newborn. He did not move. In the years before this place, before rescue, every sound he made had been answered with pain. In a circus cage, roaring had brought the sting of the prod, the shout, the bright light. Over time, silence had become his only insurance policy. Finn lifted his head. His neck trembled with the effort. He blinked once, twice, then fixed his unfocused gaze in the direction of the great golden blur before him. Some switch none of the humans could see flipped quietly inside him. His legs scrabbled. He pushed himself up. The first step was more of a slide than a step, his belly dragging through the grit. He went down on his chin, sand puffing up around his tiny face. A thin, high cry leaked out of him, startled and offended. The sound made something tight twist in Grace's chest. Ethan heard it through the microphone and felt his own shoulders tense. Finn tried again, one paw forward, then another. His claws barely scratched the ground, but he moved. The second step held. The third step was the one that counted, the one that carried him fully into the shadow of Mason's body. 3 steps between death and a miracle. That was all. Under the camera's gaze, under the worried eyes behind glass, Finn tottered closer, leaving the safety of human arms and walking straight toward the enormous creature that could end his life with a careless twitch. The evening wind gusted and rocked him sideways. He bleated, correcting his course by instinct. To him, this was simple: warmth, scent, shape. This was what a heart like his was wired to find. A parent. Mason's pupils narrowed as the tiny shape neared. His whiskers bristled. The cub's smell grew stronger, wrapping itself around old memories he had not allowed himself to touch. A den with straw. Other cubs squeaking, a mother's tongue rasping his face, the snap of a whip, the crackle of electric current, the roar that died half-born in his throat. Finn's fourth step failed him. His paw slipped on a small stone, and his body pitched forward. He hit the ground with a soft thud right in front of Mason's forepaws. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then Finn let out a scream, high and sharp, the sound of a creature that has just discovered how fragile it truly is. Maria's thumb tightened on the gate control. Donna sucked in a breath so fast it hurt her chest. Grace's hands hovered in the air, fingers curled, fighting every instinct that told her to snatch the cub back up. Mason lowered his head. The motion was slow, almost reluctant, as if he were moving under water. His mane slid forward, shadow spilling over Finn like a curtain. From the viewing shed it looked like an eclipse, golden fur blotting out the little bundle of life on the ground. One tilt of his skull, one shift of his jaw, and the story would end right there in a way no life insurance policy, no emergency fund, no carefully written grant application could ever fix. His nose came within inches of the cub. He drew in a breath, filling his chest with the scent of singed fur, formula milk, fear, and something else, trust blind and complete. Finn's cries hitched, then softened to a desperate, hitching whimper as he felt the warm air from that huge muzzle wash over him. His tiny body shivered. The whole refuge held still. The desert fell silent, as if even the wind had stopped to see what this broken lion would choose. Mason's whiskers brushed the cub's flank. His eyes, dull for so long, flickered with something old and aching. For the first time in years, he moved without waiting for a cue, without waiting for pain. His paw shifted, claws still sheathed, and began to slide forward out from under the weight of his own chest toward the shaking scrap of life that had stumbled into his shadow. And long before anyone could name it, before any lawyer or vet or visitor could decide whether this was reckless or holy, something small inside that shattered. Lion answered the cub's cry. Long before the little cub ever stumbled into his shadow, Mason had belonged to another world. It was a world of canvas tents and peeling paint, of gravel parking lots behind gas stations, of bright lights and clapping hands that never meant what they sounded like. The first memories that truly stuck in him were not of open plains or a mother's warmth, but of metal bars and the hiss of generators in the dark. As a youngster, he had roared without thinking. His voice had come up from his chest the way a yawn does, natural and lazy, a simple way of saying, "I am here." The other animals in the traveling circus answered him in their own languages. The crowd liked it. Children pointed. Parents smiled and pulled out their phones. The trainers did not like it. The first time he let loose a full, rolling roar during rehearsal, the man with the whistle flinched and dropped his clipboard. A second later, the prod touched Mason's side, a sting like lightning racing under his skin. He yelped, more in surprise than pain. The man shouted, "No, quiet!" The lesson came fast. Whenever Mason lifted his head and opened his mouth to roar, the jolt hit him. Once, twice, again. The next time he tried, the man didn't wait for the sound. He shocked him as soon as Mason drew a big breath and squared his shoulders. It didn't take long for the young lion's body to learn that swelling his chest and opening his throat led straight to hurt. In time, he stopped trying. The crowds never knew. To them, the lion pacing behind the bars was impressive enough without a voice. Children still pointed. A few well-off families, the kind who talked about their life insurance policies and retirement planning on the drive between suburbs, would stop and stare as if this caged animal were just another show to check off for the weekend. At night, when the noise died, Mason lay on bare boards and dreamed of roaring, but woke with his mouth closed, his heart pounding, afraid of a pain that wasn't even there anymore. Years rolled on that way. He grew from lanky adolescent to full-grown male, his mane thickening even as his spirit thinned. When the circus money got tight and the owners worried more about their own health insurance and gas bills than the animals, the cages got dirtier. Food came late. Veterinary visits came almost never. Eventually, a complaint made its way to the right desk. One bad inspection, one photo in the local paper, and the circus owners decided the lion was more trouble than he was worth. They called a rescue network. The day the transport came, Mason was herded into a steel crate that smelled of other frightened animals. The road ahead of the truck was long, miles of highway, motels with flickering signs, small towns with pawn shops and home security system billboards. Mason could not see any of it. He felt only the constant vibration of the truck and the old familiar dread that came with being moved without understanding why. When the doors finally opened onto the glaring New Mexico sun, the air smelled different. Dry, clean, edged with the faint scent of sagebrush and hot stone. Grace had been there that day, younger but already tired around the eyes. Ethan had been there too, clipboard tucked under one arm. They spoke softly, stayed low, moved slow. No whips, no prods. Mason didn't trust it. At High Desert Refuge, they gave him a bigger space than he had ever known. Real earth under his paws, not boards. A shaded shelter. A water trough deep enough for reflection. Medical checkups that actually helped. Quiet words. Time. He healed on the outside faster than anyone expected. His coat grew thicker. The sore spots on his legs faded. Inside, the damage stayed. He did not roar. When the other lions called out at dawn, their voices rolling across the enclosures, Mason watched the horizon and kept his mouth shut. When Blaze strutted and shouted to prove himself, Mason turned his head away. When Hazel snarled over a food dish, he walked in the opposite direction. Any time he felt a sudden urge to call, to answer, to tell the world he was still there, his ribs tightened and a ghost of electric fire crawled down his side. The staff tried. They tossed him heavy toys. They hung scents along the fence to rouse his hunting drive. Ethan played recordings of wild prides at night, hoping something in those distant calls would tug at an old memory and bring his voice back. For a while, nothing worked. In the office, under buzzing fluorescent lights, Donna clicked through spreadsheets of incoming donations and outgoing expenses. Feed, medicine, repairs, a new transport van, emergency funds. She did not hate the animals. She liked them in her way. But numbers did not lie, and the numbers said the refuge was balancing on a fence line as thin as barbed wire. She looked at Mason's file more than once. Here was a lion who could not be released because he had never truly learned to live wild. He did not breed. He did not charm visitors. He barely moved when people walked by. In staff meetings, as they discussed donor appeals and talked about older supporters downsizing, moving into senior living communities, tightening their own budgets, Donna tapped Mason's file with her pen. "This one is nothing but cost," she said once, not unkindly but firmly. "Feed, vets, space. No roar, no breeding, no draw for visitors. If we have to make hard choices, he's high on the list. We can't rescue everyone." Grace had bristled. "He's not a broken appliance, Donna. He's a sentient animal. We took him in." "I know," Donna answered, rubbing her forehead. "But good intentions don't pay the power bill." She thought of her own parents worrying over their Medicare forms and medical alert systems, and of donors who wrote moving notes but small checks. "Love is good," she added quietly, "but love still has to be funded." The conversation ended without a decision, but the seed was planted. Mason's fate was a question mark hanging over the refuge, as constant as the wind. Then, one afternoon, the sky turned the color of old pewter, and the wind came in hard from the west. Dust lifted off the hills in sheets. A wall of grit rolled across the open ground, swallowing fences and sheds in a blur. The other lions reacted the way lions do. They roared, voices ragged and fierce, throwing sound against the storm as if to prove they were still there. In his enclosure, Mason stood with his back to the incoming dust, eyes narrowed. Sand stung his face, and the air smelled like the old circus storms when the tent walls rattled and rain leaked through threadbare seams. His muscles tensed, remembering. Deep in his chest, something swelled, a pressure that rose up toward his throat. For one wild second, the urge to roar surged so strongly it almost lifted his front paws off the ground. It felt like being pulled toward the edge of a cliff. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. His body betrayed him, clamping down before the sound could form. A phantom jolt of pain flashed along the paths burned years ago by the trainer's prod. His jaw snapped shut. The moment passed. He stood alone in the storm, mane whipping around his ears, while the other lions' voices rolled over him like thunder from another country. Later that night, when the dust finally settled and the sky cleared, Mason lay in his shelter and stared into the dark. He could still feel the almost roar lodged somewhere under his ribs, heavy as a stone he could not cough up. The silence pressed on him like another kind of cage. It was in that silence that the call came about a burned lioness and a surviving cub, about a tiny life that needed more than bottles and blankets, that needed a heartbeat larger than its own to lean on. As the staff gathered in the dim office to talk about risk and duty, about safety and compassion, Mason slept alone in his pen, unaware that the next decision these tired humans made would drag him out of his private quiet and into a story he had never asked to join. And because of that choice, on a soft evening not long after, a trembling cub named Finn would be laid at his feet, and the lion who thought he had forgotten how to answer the world would find a small, insistent voice calling him back. The fire had started miles away, out where the scrub brush grew thick along an old fence line, and folks liked to sneak a cigarette on their way home from late shifts. No one ever knew exactly how the first spark caught. It could have been a tossed match, a piece of broken glass, or a lightning strike on dry grass. Out here, in high desert country, it didn't take much. One hot afternoon wind, one lazy decision from someone thinking more about their mortgage payment than the land under their feet, and the world turned the color of smoke. By the time the first 911 calls came in, the flames were already running. They leapt from bush to bush faster than a man could jog, licking along the ground and reaching for the low limbs of juniper trees. The fire crews rolled out with sirens wailing, bright trucks cutting across a landscape that had no patience for them. Retired ranchers stood by their fences, watching the orange line on the horizon and thinking about cattle, about home insurance, about the old photographs inside houses that could burn faster than any policy could replace. Near the edge of the refuge, beyond the last fence but short of the open hills, a lioness ran with smoke in her lungs and heat at her heels. She had not belonged to high desert refuge. She was a ghost from some forgotten private menagerie or the wandering remnant of a broken roadside zoo. No one knew. All Grace and Ethan ever learned was that she was young, underweight, and had been carrying more than just her own life when the fire chased her. A firefighter found her body first, crumpled near a half-burned mesquite. He saw the tan curve of her side through the smoke and froze, hand tightening on the radio. They would talk for days later about the strangeness of that moment, about seeing a wild lion here where deer and coyotes were expected. When he stepped closer, his boot scuffed something that squeaked. There, tucked into a small hollow where the lioness had tried to shield it, was a cub no bigger than a house cat's head. Its fur was singed at the tips. Its whiskers were curled from heat. It inhaled in tiny jerks, the way a newborn does when the world has already asked too much of it. "Got a live one," the firefighter said into his mic, voice softer than usual. "The mother's gone. The baby's trying." High Desert Refuge got the next call. Emergencies didn't wait for business hours or for Donna's careful planning. Grace answered on the second ring, stood listening with her free hand on the edge of her desk, eyes fixed on nothing as the report came through. Lioness down. One cub alive. No obvious way to reunite with a pride. No time to start a debate about whether the land could support another predator. "Bring the cub here," Grace said. Her heart and her training spoke together. "We'll do what we can." Finn arrived wrapped in a soot-stained towel, smelling of smoke, fear, and raw milk the firefighters had tried to coax into him with an eyedropper. In the infirmary, under bright lights and the hum of equipment powered by a generator older than half the staff, Grace and a vet tech worked in a tight, practiced rhythm. They cleared his lungs as best they could. They started fluids. They checked his eyes, his reflexes, the tiny pads of his paws. His breathing was ragged, but the small chest kept rising and falling. "He wants to be here," Grace murmured, as much to herself as to the tech. That's half the battle. Shifts changed. Outside, the fire lines held. People in town checked their home security systems and watched the local news, grateful that the flames had not jumped the highway. At the refuge, night settled in with the usual sounds: the rustle of straw, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional yawn from a big cat. Under it all, in the infirmary, there was the faint, stubborn rasp of Finn's breath. For 2 days and nights, Grace and Ethan and a rotating crew of techs and volunteers fed him by hand every few hours. They warmed towels in the dryer and wrapped him like a tiny, complaining burrito. Maria, on her night rounds, would tiptoe in from time to time, drawn as much by the soft noises as by any checklist. She had raised 2 sons of her own on graveyard shifts and supermarket coffee. The rhythm of alarm clocks and bottles was written in her bones. "Hey, little man," she whispered once when it was just the two of them. "You picked a hard place to land, but you're in good hands." The problem, everyone knew, was that hands were not enough. Bottle feeding could keep his body going, the way a solid retirement plan could stretch savings for years, but it couldn't teach him what it meant to be a lion. No amount of excellent health insurance could give him a father's rough tongue, a mother's scolding paw, the safe warmth of a flank to crawl against in the dark. Finn needed something they could not give, no matter how dedicated the staff or how carefully Donna balanced the budget. On the third morning, when Finn's breathing had eased and his eyes followed the movement of a finger across his tiny pen, Grace called a meeting. The whole core team squeezed into the break room. Ethan with his behavioral charts, Maria still smelling faintly of coffee and disinfectant, a young intern clutching a notepad, and Donna with her laptop open, spreadsheets glowing like a storm front. Grace laid it out plain. Finn's mother was gone. There was no known pride to return him to. Raising him entirely by human hand risked turning him into another Mason. Alive, but always on the outside of his own species, never quite fitting anywhere. Another option was to transfer him to a larger facility several states away that specialized in hand-reared big cats. That would mean a long transport for a fragile cub and a price tag that made Donna's jaw clench. "We could cover it," Donna said slowly, "if we cut some maintenance and delay a few projects. Maybe renegotiate a feed contract. But we're already stretched. Our donors are aging. Some are dealing with their own medical bills, talking to long-term care insurance brokers, downsizing their homes. They give what they can, but we can't count on them to fill every gap." "And if we keep him?" Ethan asked. Grace glanced toward the window where a slice of Mason's enclosure was visible between the blinds. The big lion lay stretched in the shade, seemingly asleep, but she knew his ears caught every distant sound. "If we keep him, we have to find a way to give him a lion for a parent," she said. "Not just people." Silence fell, heavy as a winter coat. The obvious candidates among their lionesses were wrong for different reasons. Hazel was dominant and short-tempered. Nova was still adjusting to her own rescue. Neither felt safe enough to risk placing a fire-damaged cub at their feet. "What about Mason?" Ethan said. Every head turned. The suggestion hung there, ridiculous and strangely perfect at the same time. Mason, who hadn't roared in years. Mason, who avoided the others and flinched at their arguments. Mason, who had grown up learning that every natural impulse brought punishment. Donna recovered first. "You want to put a newborn at the mercy of a lion who barely interacts with his own kind?" she asked. "If he hurts that cub, the video goes viral, and every attorney in the state starts calling me. We would lose donors, lose grants, maybe lose the refuge. There is such a thing as too much risk." Ethan didn't back down. "He's gentle with us. He's never lunged, never swatted, even when we've had to sedate him. His problem isn't aggression. It's that he's got no reason to wake up in the morning. We keep giving him enrichment like he's bored. I don't think he's bored. I think he's empty." Grace listened, heart split between fear and a strange, growing hope. She thought about the way Mason watched the horizon. She thought about Finn's tiny body pressed against a warming pad, searching for something that pad would never be. "Sometimes," Ethan went on, "the only thing that brings someone back is being needed. Really needed. Not as a showpiece, not as a sad story on a brochure about animal rescue, but as the difference between life and death for someone smaller than you. We see it with people, too. Folks who finally quit drinking when a grandbaby is born. Veterans who start going to group therapy because a kid needs them to. Being needed is better than any self-help book or retirement seminar." Maria cleared her throat. "If Mason wanted to hurt somebody," she said quietly, "he's had chances. Plenty. I'm more afraid of what happens to that cub if he never learns to trust another lion." All eyes turned to Grace. In the end, decisions like this landed on her shoulders, not on the donors who wrote checks with shaking hands, not on the visitors who took guided tours and went home to their safe suburbs and life insurance policies. It was Grace who signed the forms, who stood in the enclosures, who carried the weight when things went wrong. That night, after the others had gone home, she sat alone in her office. The overhead light hummed. Outside, one of the other lions gave a long, drowsy call and was answered by another. Mason did not join them. On her desk lay 2 folders, one for Mason, thick with history, and one for Finn, thin but heavy with meaning. She opened them both, read the notes again, studied the photos. The broken adult, the scorched baby. There were safer choices. They could send Finn away, hope the transport went smoothly, trust strangers to do the raising. They could keep everything neat for the paperwork and the funders, play it safe the way financial advisors say to do with retirement savings when the market looks shaky. Or they could gamble on the idea that somewhere under Mason's scars, under the layers of old fear, there was still a lion who remembered what it meant to answer a cub's cry. Just before midnight, Grace picked up a pen. Her hand shook a little as she signed the necessary line. In the morning, she would carry Finn out to Mason's enclosure and let the cub choose his own fate. And in doing so, she would give a silent lion one last impossible chance to remember who he was meant to be. Mason's paw slid forward, slow as sunrise. The claws stayed sheathed. The pads, worn smooth by years of pacing on boards and concrete, pressed gently into the sand until they formed a small wall between Finn and the rest of the world. The cub's cries faltered at the change in shape and smell, shifting from panic to confusion. From the viewing shed, it looked like the whole high desert had narrowed to that one motion. Ethan held his breath without realizing it. Maria's coffee cooled between her fingers. Donna, who could usually think of 3 worst-case scenarios before she finished a line of any document, found her mind oddly blank. Mason lowered his head the rest of the way. His mane fell around his face in a thick golden curtain, turning the tiny space between his chest and paw into a kind of makeshift den. His nose brushed Finn's side, not with the hard shove of a predator testing food, but with the hesitant sniff of someone trying to remember a scent they used to know by heart. Finn hiccuped one last time and went still. The rough warmth of that breath, the steady thump of the lion's heart somewhere above him, the feel of fur instead of towel under his paws. It was all his small body had been wired to search for. His eyes squeezed shut, more from exhaustion than fear now, and his front paws flexed in a tiny kneading motion against Mason's toes. In the shed, the monitor showed Mason's eyes in close-up. They had been flat and distant for so long that most of the staff had stopped looking for anything inside them. Now, as the cub settled, something shifted. It wasn't sudden or dramatic, just a softening at the edges, a faint, startled widening, the way someone looks when a phone rings in a house they thought was empty. "He's accepting him," Ethan whispered. Donna said nothing. Her mind was already writing the incident report she'd been afraid she'd need, only the words she'd expected. Attack and injury and liability didn't fit what she was seeing. The part of her that lived on budgets and risk assessments, on stories of people losing homes because they had the wrong kind of home insurance or no savings for an emergency, understood the danger. The older, quieter part of her, the part that remembered rocking her sister's baby in a cramped apartment years ago, understood something else. Grace stood inside the safety gate, just far enough back not to make Mason feel boxed in, close enough to move if everything went wrong. Her knees ached from kneeling, her throat felt tight. She had been there when people signed "Do not resuscitate" orders for old pets, when they asked about payment plans and pet insurance and how much one more surgery would cost. She knew the limits of what medicine and money could do. What she was watching now wasn't in any manual. "Easy, boy," she murmured, though Mason wasn't looking at her. Just breathe. Finn did the rest. The cub's body sagged against the warmth, his tense limbs finally giving up the fight. A tiny sigh escaped him, high and soft, and his head rolled until his cheek rested directly against the thick fur on Mason's paw. In less than a minute, his breathing slowed into the ragged rhythm of a baby drifting into sleep. Mason stayed where he was. 1 minute, 2, 5. The sun slipped lower, turning the enclosure's sand to a muted gold. The wind cooled. A truck rumbled past on the distant highway, its low growl barely reaching them. Through it all, the lion did not move his head, did not shift his paw, did not reclaim the space he had given up. It had been years since he had held still for anything except fear. All at once, he was holding still for something else. In the viewing shed, Maria quietly set her coffee aside and leaned closer to the monitor. She had seen parents stand like that in waiting rooms, frozen so long their backs hurt, afraid that if they sat down, the news would turn bad. She picked up a small handheld camera from the shelf and started recording, not for social media, not yet, but for the refuge's records, for the small private file where they kept the moments that reminded them why they dealt with late-night calls and grant applications and broken fences. As the light faded, a moth bumped against the shed's glass, tapping in a slow, confused rhythm. Donna finally exhaled. "Gate stays locked," she said almost to herself. "We don't interfere unless we have to." Agreed? Ethan nodded. Grace didn't answer out loud, but the set of her shoulders said the same thing. Some choices were like signing a mortgage or committing to a retirement plan. Once you made them, you lived with them for a very long time. This was one of those. They had placed a burned little life and a broken big one in the same space. Now they had to trust that the instinct older than any human contract would hold. Time stretched. A fly landed on Mason's nose and crawled along his whiskers. He didn't twitch. Finn's tiny jaw worked in his sleep, chasing some fading memory of milk. Every so often, the cub's hind legs gave a soft kick, as if he were running in a dream. Each time, Mason's paw tightened just enough to keep the small body from rolling away. At some point, Grace realized her calves were shaking from standing so long. She backed slowly through the inner gate, never turning her back on the pair in the sand. When she finally reached the outer fence, she let herself sink onto a bench, the adrenaline leaving her limbs all at once. "That's one for the books," Ethan said quietly, stepping out to join her. "I've sat through enough estate planning seminars with my dad to know a long shot. When I see one, we just watched one pay off." Grace huffed a breath that was almost a laugh. "Don't jinx it. We're not out of the woods yet." They weren't. The cub would need feeding in a couple of hours. They would have to figure out how to get bottles into that makeshift family without breaking whatever fragile thread had just formed. There would be long nights ahead, vet checks, behavioral notes, debates about when to introduce Finn to the rest of the pride. There would be donors to reassure, grants to write, endless practical details like the interest rate on the refuge's line of credit and the rising cost of feed. But for the moment, none of that reached into the circle of light where a once silent lion lay guarding a child of fire. Just before dark, a metal cart rattled against a concrete pad somewhere near the feed room. The sound rang out sharp in the quiet. Finn jerked awake with a thin cry, eyes wide, heart pounding under his fragile ribs. His tiny muscles tried to curl him tighter against the sand, but there was nowhere to go. The world, from his angle, was all sky and shadow. Mason moved before any human could. His body flowed sideways, a single smooth curve of muscle and fur, until his chest and foreleg formed a higher wall around the cub. His head came up, ears pricked, eyes bright for the first time in years. He stared toward the source of the noise, not with the flinch of someone awaiting punishment, but with the steady, measuring look of a guardian. Finn scrambled immediately toward that solid barrier, pressing himself into the thick fur of Mason's leg. His cries softened to little puffs of sound. His paws, still clumsy, tried to burrow deeper. Mason did not roar. His throat stayed silent, the old habit still stronger than this new stirring. But his stance said everything. To anyone watching, it was clear. The cub had chosen him, and in some quiet corner of his battered mind, he had begun to choose the cub in return. The desert night came on by degrees. Stars pricked through the darkening sky, one by one. Somewhere a coyote called. The other lions murmured and rustled in their own enclosures, but their voices seemed farther away than usual. Inside the ring of Mason's paw and chest, Finn finally sighed and went limp again, asleep in the only home he had left. And the lion, who had spent years trying not to exist too loudly, lay awake a long time, listening to the tiny heartbeat against his fur, as if relearning the sound of his own life. The first night after Finn chose Mason, nobody at High Desert Refuge really slept. The staff took turns pretending they were relaxed, drinking bad coffee and checking the cameras every few minutes. The desert air cooled quickly after sunset, and the sand gave back the day's heat like an old stove cooling down. Inside Mason's enclosure, the heat lingered longer in the lion's thick fur. Finn discovered that quickly. Around 9 o'clock, the cub woke and realized his belly was empty. Exhaustion and relief had carried him through those first hours, but milk doesn't last long in a body that small. He squirmed, paws digging into the sand, bleating softly. For a moment he tried to root against Mason's chest, his mouth searching for something that wasn't there. Mason jerked, startled, as tiny teeth and gums pressed into his skin. He looked down, confused. In his memories, milk had come from bowls shoved under cage doors, not from any living body. The idea that someone might be looking to him for it was as foreign as a bank statement would have been to him, numbers and promises he had never learned to read. Finn's complaints grew louder. In the viewing shed, Maria flinched at the sound and reached for the radio. But Ethan's voice came through first. "Give them a minute," he said, sounding calmer than he felt. "Watch." Mason did not move away. That was the first small miracle. He shifted his weight, clumsily trying to curl himself around the restless cub. Finn's head butted against his foreleg, then his belly, then the bare skin inside his elbow, as if trying all the doors in a dark hallway. Nothing opened. No milk came. The cries sharpened. Something old and wordless stirred in Mason, a discomfort that wasn't physical, a feeling that the noise needed fixing. He had no memory of how. In the circus, crying had only ever meant more noise, more chaos, more shouts. Here, alone with the cub, there was no one to bark orders, no electric prod to enforce silence. There was just that small, insistent voice and his own unease. Slowly, Mason got to his feet, careful not to step on Finn. The cub toppled sideways, then righted himself and followed the movement like a little shadow. Mason walked in a tight circle, as if pacing might shake an answer loose from his stiff joints. It didn't. Finn trotted after him, his legs wobbling, his protests echoing off the fence. In the shed, Maria muttered, "He's looking for the nurse," before she even realized she'd spoken. Years of raising babies on overnight shifts had taught her the look of a confused new father. On his third circle, Mason did something no one had expected. He lowered his head, picked Finn up by the scruff with surprising care, and carried him toward the gate. The image on the monitor made Donna put down her pen. Mason's big body moved slowly, deliberately, the way someone might carry a fragile box marked family heirloom instead of a snarling predator's offspring. Finn dangled from his jaws, legs tucked up, finally quiet. At the inner gate, Mason stopped. The heavy metal bars and mesh didn't offer him any way through. He pressed his nose against them anyway, cub still hanging from his mouth, and stood there. In the shed, Maria bolted upright. "He's bringing him to us," she said, "like he wants help." Ethan grabbed the radio. "Grace, you seeing this?" "I'm here," came her quick reply from the corridor. She had been on her way to mix another bottle, the way a parent checks the clock for the next dose of medication. "Don't spook him. Maria, meet me at the service door with the milk." The plan that followed was invented in the space of a few heartbeats. Grace stepped into the outer corridor with the bottle ready. Maria approached the outside of the enclosure fence quietly, talking in a soft, steady stream. "Hey, big guy," she crooned, as if Mason could understand words as well as tone. "You did good. Let's help the little one out." Through the mesh, Mason's eyes tracked the bottle in Grace's hand. He shifted his grip on Finn, lowering the cub until his paws brushed the ground, but not letting go completely. It was as if he were saying, "I will bring him, but I won't surrender him, not all the way." Grace crouched, sliding the bottle's rubber nipple through an opening in the lower mesh, her movements as controlled as a surgeon handling a delicate instrument. Finn, catching the familiar smell, twisted and squirmed until Mason loosened his hold just enough. The cub latched on greedily, tiny paws thumping against the fence. For the next few minutes, the three of them, lion, cub, and human, formed a strange little triangle at the gate. Mason stayed close, his breath warming Finn's back as the cub drank. Grace held steady, ignoring the ache in her wrist. When Finn's sucking slowed and his eyelids drooped, Mason gently took him up again and walked back to the center of the enclosure. "He just used us like a night nurse," Maria said later with a tired smile. "Smart man." The pattern repeated through the night. Every few hours, Finn's hunger woke him. Mason, no longer pacing aimlessly, seemed to know what to do. Pick the cub up, carry him to the gate, wait until the bottle arrived. Each time the routine became a little smoother. Each time some invisible thread between them tightened. Days blurred into a new kind of normal. Finn grew. His legs steadied. His eyes brightened. He learned that there were two kinds of warmth in his world: the human hands that brought milk and medicine, and the great humming furnace of Mason's body that never seemed to go cold. When the sun climbed high and the shade shrank, the staff opened the side panel to a slightly larger yard. It had low scrub, a couple of battered toys, the kind of space that gives a young animal room to practice being alive. Mason stepped out first, blinking in the brightness. Finn followed close, tripping over his own feet. That's when Rusty entered their story. Rusty was an old ranch dog who had ended up at the refuge when his owner passed away and the family couldn't keep him. He was some mix of shepherd and something else, gray around the muzzle, slow in the hips, but sharp in the eyes. Officially, he lived near the maintenance sheds, a sort of retired guard with more sense than speed. Unofficially, he made his own rounds. On that afternoon, he ambled along. The outer path stopped at the sight of the new pair in the yard and sat down just beyond the outer fence. His ears pricked. His tail thumped once. Finn saw him and froze. The dog smelled different from lions, different from humans, different from anything. He took a few tentative steps toward the fence, nose twitching. Rusty huffed and lowered his head, giving a polite wag as if greeting a particularly odd puppy. Mason moved up behind Finn, chest tight. Dogs, in his old life, had meant noise and more stress. But Rusty's body language was calm, respectful. Mason's muscles eased. Finn crept closer, curiosity winning over caution. After a long, quiet minute, the cub gave up and galloped back to pounce on Mason's tail, and Rusty trotted on, satisfied. The real test came a few nights later. The smell of milk, meat, and small, unsteady life does not go unnoticed in the wild. A loose pack of half-wild dogs, coyote mixes from the dump outside town, had taken to ranging near the refuge perimeter, hoping for leftovers. Usually the fences, lights, and the occasional warning shot kept them moving, but on that night the moon was thin, the security lights near Mason's section flickered, and hunger can make any creature bold. Mason slept lightly, dream fragments tugging at him. canvas walls, shouting, the harsh buzz of the prod. Finn's warm weight lay against his side. The air was cool, the sand comfortable. Then a new scent drifted in. Rank fur, old garbage, sharp hunger. Finn shifted and snuffled in his sleep, unaware. Outside the outer fence, shadows gathered. Shapes moved low to the ground, noses pressed to the chain link. A muzzle pushed against the gap near one post. Another followed. Yellow eyes glittered in the dark. Finn woke with a start at the sound of claws scraping metal. He sat up, ears too big for his head, and peered toward the movement. To him, it was just a new curiosity. He toddled forward, wobbling a little, a soft, questioning chirp escaping his throat. Mason's eyes snapped open. He rose in a single motion, heart slamming against his ribs. The smell of the pack hit him fully now, lean, desperate, not unlike the stray dogs that had circled the circus grounds when the garbage bins were full. Instinct, deeper than training and fear, flooded him. Finn, oblivious, drew closer to the inner fence, the one that separated him from the outside world by only a few feet of sand and steel. A dark shape on the other side mirrored his approach, breath fogging the metal. Teeth flashed in the sliver of security light that still worked. The cub gave a tiny, excited squeak. The dog on the other side answered with a low growl and bumped the fence harder, testing. Mason didn't think. He moved. He lunged between Finn and the fence, body slamming into the chain link with a force that rattled the posts in their concrete. The crash rang through the night like a gunshot. Finn went flying sideways in a puff of sand, more surprised than hurt. From deep inside Mason, something tore loose. It wasn't a full, clean roar, not yet, but a raw, tearing sound clawed its way out of his chest. It was part snarl, part bellow, the first real noise he had made against the world in years. It burned on the way up, setting old scars alight. The pack of dogs scattered. Whatever hunger had brought them this close fled in the face of that wall of fury. They vanished into the dark with tails tucked, their paws drumming a retreat on the hard ground. In the viewing shed, Maria jerked awake in her chair, heart pounding. The monitor showed a blur of motion, then settled on Mason standing tall, fur bristling between the cub and the fence. Finn scrambled on unsteady legs back toward him, more frightened by the sudden chaos than by the distant dogs. He pressed himself into Mason's hind leg, sides heaving. Mason did not look down. His eyes stayed on the darkness beyond the fence until all scent and sound of danger were gone. Only then did his shoulders drop. He backed away from the fence and turned, lowering himself slowly until his great head was level with the shaking cub. Finn climbed instantly into the hollow between his forelegs, shoving his face into the familiar mane as if to erase the memory of sharp smells and harder sounds. Mason's throat worked. A tiny, rough grumble vibrated through his chest, half purr, half something else. It was not pain this time. It was a warning lingering in the air, like a home security system that keeps watch even after the alarm has quieted. For the first time, his old silence had broken, not out of fear, but out of protection. And though he did not know it yet, that ragged sound was the first cracked note of the roar that would one day roll across the refuge like thunder, awakened not by a crowd or a trainer's command, but by a small, orphaned cub who had decided a broken lion was still worth trusting. By the time the heat settled in for good that summer, Finn's spots had started to fade. He wasn't the smoky little scrap of fur they had pulled from the fire anymore. His legs had lengthened, his paws had grown comically big, and his eyes held the kind of bold curiosity only the very young and the very lucky carry. To Finn, the world now came in three parts. There was the steady, warm center of Mason's body, always there to lean against. There were the humans with their bottles and soft voices, who smelled of coffee and soap and something sharp from the clinic. And beyond the fence, there were shapes and sounds he did not yet understand. Mason watched it all. He had grown used to the feel of the cub pressed against him at night, to the tug of small teeth at his mane, to the way Finn used his tail as a toy and his shoulders as a jungle gym. In the beginning, he had tolerated it the way a patient man tolerates a nervous habit. Somewhere along the way, without meaning to, he had begun to enjoy it. One morning, Blaze strutted along the far fence line, his red-tinged mane catching the light. He was younger than Mason, all muscle and restless energy. Finn spotted him and froze, head cocked, ears tipped forward. Mason's body tensed. Blaze gave a short, questioning roar, more of a shout than a challenge. It rolled across the distance between enclosures, bouncing off the concrete pads and steel bars. Finn stiffened, instinct warring with confusion. The sound was in his bones, even if no one had yet taught him what it meant. Mason felt the old fear clamp down. That noise, that posture, that bright, swaggering presence, every part of it called up memories of other lions roaring in cages, of stress and chaos, of trainers shouting over the noise. His chest wanted to answer, to send something back. His throat closed on the impulse, the echo of pain from years ago rising like heartburn. Behind the scenes, Ethan had been waiting for this moment. He'd watched the way Finn's eyes followed Blaze and Hazel and Nova whenever they passed by. He'd seen Mason's ears flick toward the other lions, even when his gaze stayed fixed on the horizon. "The kid needs to know his own kind," Ethan said in one staff meeting, flipping through his behavior notes. "We can't raise him to think he's half dog and half human. Mason's a good father, but he can't be the whole world forever." Grace understood. So did Maria. They had children and nieces and nephews of their own, kids they'd seen go from clinging to a parent's leg in the grocery store to walking into a new school on their own. Keeping a child too close could wound them just as surely as neglect. Donna, meanwhile, had her own worry lines. She sat at the far end of the table with her laptop open, the refuge's accounts glowing in neat columns. Fuel costs were up. Meat prices had jumped again. Donations from older supporters had dipped. Some were dealing with medical bills and prescription costs. Others were adjusting to fixed retirement income. A few had written apologetic notes about tightening our budget and talking to a financial advisor about our long-term care. "We can't ignore the money side," Donna said. "We took in Finn when the fire hit, and that was the right thing to do. But this place survives on donations, grants, and a very thin cushion. Feed, meds, utilities, insurance. None of that gets cheaper. Our liability coverage, our property and home insurance on these buildings, the veterinary equipment, the health insurance we provide staff, it all adds up." She hesitated, then tapped Mason's file again. "If we're going to keep rescuing, we have to be realistic about which animals can move on and which can't. Larger facilities have already asked if we'd consider transferring him. They think he's taking up a slot that could go to a breeding male." Grace felt something cold tighten under her breastbone. "He's not a broken appliance to trade in," she said, more sharply than she meant. "I know that," Donna replied, her voice softening. "But if we don't look at the numbers, we risk all of them. We're not talking about canceling a cable plan, Grace. We're talking about whether the refuge can keep its doors open in 5 years. If we make a mistake, there's no life insurance policy big enough to fix it." The room fell quiet. Outside, Finn bounced off the low stump in his yard and tackled Mason's foreleg, teeth bared in a play growl. Mason tilted his head, watching him, the ghost of a smile in his eyes. It was Ethan who broke the silence. "If we want Finn to have a future as a lion, we have to get him used to the pride," he said. "And if we want donors to understand why Mason matters, we need more than a sad story. We need to show that he's part of something bigger than his own pain." So they made a plan. First, they adjusted the yards so that on certain mornings, Finn and Mason could come right up to the dividing fence that bordered Blaze and Nova's enclosure. A second inner line kept them all from touching, but they could see and smell and hear each other clearly. On the first day of the new routine, Grace stood by the control panel, one hand on the gate latch. Easy, she reminded herself as much as Mason. We're just letting them talk through the fence. Mason stepped out, Finn at his heels. Blaze approached from the other side, posture tall. Nova hung back a little, watching with calm, steady eyes. She had more patience than Blaze, more sense too. Finn's tail puffed straight up. He let out a tiny, squeaky sound that thought it was a roar. Blaze paused, then answered with a short, amused rumble. The vibration of it traveled through the fence, into the sand, into Finn's paws. Mason's muscles locked. Every fiber in him screamed to pull Finn back, to block him from the sound, the sight, the danger he had known in other cages. But Finn did what young things do. He stepped toward the fence, nose twitching, curiosity burning away caution. Mason moved with him, half a step behind, body angled so that he could shield the cub if Blaze's energy shifted. He didn't leave. That, for him, was a kind of courage. Blaze barked out another roar, testing, feeling, announcing himself. Finn flinched and spun, eyes wide, looking up at Mason as if to ask whether this was a threat or a lesson. Mason met his gaze. Somewhere, under the layers of training and fear, he knew what a father should do. Not erase the world's noise, but stand steady in it. His chest swelled. For a heartbeat he wanted to roar back, to show Finn that voices didn't have to mean pain. The old phantom jolt flashed along his ribs. His jaws clamped shut. No sound came. Still he didn't run. Ethan, watching from the shed, marked the moment in his notebook. He stayed, he wrote, didn't flee, stayed between Finn and the others. Day by day the fence meetings continued. Finn learned Blaze's moods, the way the younger males' shoulders rose when he was excited, the flick of Nova's tail when she'd had enough. He learned that not every roar was a threat, and not every snarl meant disaster. Mason learned too in his own way. He learned that he could stand with his son on the line between safety and fear and not be swept away. While that slow education unfolded in the sun and dust, another kind of negotiation was happening inside the office. Donna answered emails from a larger sanctuary in another state, one with more land and deeper pockets. They wanted to know, again, if Mason was available for transfer. "We could move him," Donna told Grace one afternoon, voice tired. "They have better facilities. They're funded by a big foundation. They're the kind of place that has an endowment big enough to impress a financial planner. Mason would be cared for. It would free up resources here." Grace looked out the window. In the yard, Finn was pressed against the fence, nose to nose with Nova through the mesh, their whiskers almost touching. Mason sat just behind him, a solid, silent presence. "If you take him away," she said quietly, "you don't just move one lion, you rip the ground out from under that cub." Donna followed her gaze. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she closed the laptop with a soft click. "Then we'd better find a way," she said, "for him and for this place." Neither of them knew yet that the answer would come not from numbers in a spreadsheet, but from the sound of a roar breaking loose on a stormy night, and from the people whose hearts would answer it. The storm rolled in the way big things often do in the desert, slow at first, almost polite. All afternoon the sky to the west had worn a faint bruise of cloud, the kind that made ranchers glance up from their fence posts and feel, somewhere under the ribs, that old uneasy tug. By evening the bruise had spread, darkening until even the hardened hills looked small beneath it. At High Desert Refuge the air turned heavy. The lions felt it before the people did. Blaze paced his yard, tail lashing, throwing short, irritated roars at the thickening wind. Hazel snarled at nothing and everything. Even Nova, usually as calm as an old cat on a sunny porch, stood with her nose in the air, tasting the charge building above. In Mason's enclosure, Finn bounced between excitement and unease. Lightning stitched white veins through the sky, far off yet, but close enough to show him the outlines of the world in sharp, frightening detail. Each flash turned his shadow into something big and strange, and he pounced on it, pretending bravery. Mason watched him, lying with his forelegs folded and his head up. The clouds reminded him of old circus storms, when thunder had rattled the metal of his cage and the canvas roof had snapped like a whip. Back then, he'd learned to make himself small, to let the noise pass through him. Now there was Finn. The first thunder reached them as a bull-taw, low, rolling grumble, more felt than heard. Finn froze mid-pounce, ears flicking. A moment later, the sound deepened, closer, wrapping around the refuge like a giant's growl. The cub's eyes widened. He looked back at Mason, as if to ask whether this was play or danger. "It's just the sky talking," Maria murmured in the viewing shed, watching the monitor. She knew the sound well. Storms had rattled the old windows of every rental she'd ever lived in, from tiny apartments to the little house she'd finally managed to buy after years of work and careful budgeting. On the office wall behind her, Donna's whiteboard listed bills coming due: feed, utilities, vet supplies, the latest bump in their liability insurance. Somewhere on that list, in smaller letters, she had written, "Review life insurance and health insurance for staff after their broker's last visit." The world beyond the fences was full of its own thunder. The sky's voice grew louder. Lightning tore across the clouds, closer now, and the thunder cracked almost on top of it. Finn flinched so hard his paws slipped in the sand. A startled cry burst out of him, thin and sharp. He scrambled toward Mason without thinking, colliding with the lion's chest and trying to burrow straight through him. Mason curled instinctively around him, chest forming a solid wall, mane falling over Finn's back like a curtain. The cub's heart hammered against his leg. Another flash, another boom, sharp enough to make the metal fence ring. This time Finn did not just flinch, he panicked. The little body shuddered, breath coming in ragged, high-pitched gasps. He clawed at Mason's fur, trying to climb, to get higher, to escape a fear that had no clear shape. To Finn, born in fire and saved by hands and bottles and one silent lion, the storm sounded like the end of the world coming back to finish the job. In the shed, Grace's hand tightened on the edge of the console. "If he hyperventilates like that," she started, already thinking of fragile lungs scarred by smoke. "Let's wait one more minute," Ethan said softly. He didn't take his eyes off the screen. "He's not alone this time." On the monitor, Mason's pupils were blown wide, black swallowing gold. Thunder had always meant trouble, in his past life too, chaos, backstage, shouting, the crack of the whip as people rushed to break down tents before the wind took them. His own fear rose, hot and familiar. But pressed against him, Finn's terror felt hotter. A lightning strike hit close enough to light the world stark and white. The crack of it was like a gunshot, like a steel bar dropped on concrete. Finn screamed, a sound that cut through every layer of memory and training Mason had built. It was the sound of small, helpless life saying, "I can't do this alone." Something snapped. Mason surged to his feet, not to run, but to stand. He planted his paws, braced his shoulders, lifted his head toward the churning sky, and he roared. The sound tore out of him as if it had been waiting in his chest for years, bruising his ribs from the inside on its way out. It started low, deep in his belly, climbed his throat, and exploded into the storm in a rolling, thunderous wave. This was no half-strangled grunt, no accidental bark. It was a full, perfect roar, the kind his body had been made to make before fear rewrote his story. In the split second between lightning and thunder, Mason's voice filled everything. It shook the fence posts. It vibrated through the concrete pads, through the bones of every animal within hearing. In the other enclosures, Blaze and Hazel and Nova answered, their roars rising like a chorus around him, acknowledging, welcoming, challenging. Finn stopped screaming mid-breath. The roar washed over him like a shield, louder than the thunder, steadier than the wind. He stared up at Mason with round, wet eyes, chest still heaving, and something in his small face changed. The storm outside was still there, but the storm inside had been given a leader. Mason's roar faded, echoing off the hills. Rain finally broke, spattering the dust, turning it to dark, wet patches. The air cooled all at once. In the shed, no one spoke. Maria had tears on her cheeks she would not admit to. Ethan felt a knot in his throat that reminded him oddly of sitting in church as a boy when the choir hit a note that made the air feel thin. Grace just stood very still, hand over her mouth, remembering the day she had read "Vocalization Suppressed" in Mason's old file, and wondered if they would ever hear his voice. "Did you get that?" Donna whispered to Lena Park, who stood at the back of the shed, camera still raised. Lena nodded, eyes wide behind her viewfinder. The young filmmaker had come to the refuge a week earlier to shoot some general footage for a short documentary on wildfire recovery and animal rescue. She had been capturing B-roll of the darkening sky when Mason's roar had shattered the evening. "I got all of it," she said, "from the lightning to—" She gestured helplessly toward the monitor. "To that." The storm moved on. The rain eased to a mist, then to nothing. The sky, wrung out, let the stars through again. In his enclosure, Mason lowered himself back down, curling his body around Finn, who climbed onto his forelegs and settled, chest to chest. Each time the wind rattled the fence or a distant rumble rolled by, Mason rumbled back. Short, quiet sounds this time. Reassurance more than challenge. "You're not alone. I am here. The storm is loud, but so am I." Within an hour, Finn's breathing had eased into sleep. Later that night, while the refuge dozed and the desert dried, Lena sat in the tiny guest room they'd given her, laptop open, headphones on. She scrubbed through the fresh footage, heart hammering again as the lightning flashed and the roar shook her bones all over, even through cheap speakers. She watched Finn's terrified scramble, Mason's rise, the moment the cub's eyes changed. "This isn't just a lion video," she murmured. "This is a comeback story." She cut a short piece, barely 2 minutes long. Mason and Finn. The roar, the storm. A gentle voiceover she recorded right there, explaining in simple words what viewers were seeing. A lion who had been punished for roaring, learning to use his voice again, not for a crowd, but for one scared child. She ended it with a single line on screen. "He was a lion who no longer roared until an orphan cub adopted him as its father." Lena uploaded it that night on her small channel and sent the link to Grace with a note. "If you're okay with this, share it. People need to see why this place matters." By morning, the clip was already traveling farther than any of them expected. At first, it was just the usual trickle: other wildlife lovers, a few local folks, some older subscribers who watched everything she posted and left kind comments. Then someone shared it in a group for retired firefighters. Someone else posted it in a forum for veterans. A woman who taught a support group for widows shared it with the caption, "Proof that second chances are real, for all of us." In the refuge office, Donna's email filled with subject lines that made her blink. "How can we help Mason and Finn? Monthly donations set up." "This story saved me today." Small contributions came in, $5 here, $20 there, with notes from people on fixed incomes, from families juggling retirement planning and medical bills and still finding room for a little generosity. One message stood out. It was from a man named Harold Bennett, a Vietnam veteran living 2 towns over. "I saw your video," he wrote. "That lion looks like I did when I came home, quiet because it seemed safer. That little one is my grandson, who climbed into my lap one day and didn't care that I was broken. If you ever let folks visit, I'd like to come see him." Donna printed that email and taped it to the corner of her computer screen. Next to the spreadsheet columns of expenses and projected donations, it looked small and personal and entirely unprofessional. She left it there anyway. Later that day, in a staff meeting, she told them about the clip, the messages, the small new stream of monthly donors. She mentioned, almost grudgingly, that a couple of them had even asked specifically to sponsor Mason and Finn, as if they understood that the two lives were bound together. "Does it fix everything?" she said, looking at Grace and Ethan and Maria in turn. "No, we still have meat to buy and fences to mend. We still have to think about home insurance and health insurance and all the boring things that will keep this place standing. But it's a start, and more than that." She glanced at the printout of Harold's email, then back at the monitor, where Mason slept with Finn sprawled over his paws. It's proof that what happened out there last night means something to people who will never set foot in this refuge." She closed her laptop, leaving her earlier transfer emails unanswered. "For now," she said, "Mason stays. Decision's not forever. But I'm not shipping off the lion who just found his roar again, not until we see what this story wants to do." Outside, unaware of the conversations he had sparked, Mason yawned, a deep, easy sound, and shifted to give Finn a more comfortable pillow of fur. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered, in the air, in the lion's chest, and now, far beyond the fences, in the hearts of people who recognized their own battles in a roar that refused to stay buried. 3 years is a long time in the life of a lion, and a blink in the life of a refugee. Seasons turned over high desert refuge, baking the sand in summer, dusting the far hills with brief winter snow, washing the fences clean in spring storms. Through it all, Finn grew. He was no longer the smoky scrap they'd pulled from the fire. He had the long-legged look of a young male, mane just starting to thicken around his neck, shoulders widening. When he walked beside Blaze now, he matched him nearly stride for stride. The spots on his legs had faded to faint ghosts, the last visible reminder of how small he once was. Mason grew too, but in a different direction. His mane silvered at the edges, not from old age alone, but from stress finally easing. The muscles along his back softened. Sometimes his hips were slow to unkink in the mornings. Yet there was a lightness in him no one had seen when he first arrived, a relaxed set to his jaw, a habit of stretching full length in the sun as if the world no longer owed him pain. The refuge changed around them. After Lena's short film of the storm and the roar went out into the world, visitors started calling, writing, asking if they could come see the lion who found his voice again, and the cub who had needed him. They weren't all young families with strollers. Many were older couples who arrived together in sensible shoes, or widows with careful steps and kind eyes, or veterans who moved with the stiffness of old injuries and the quiet of old memories. On certain days, the staff opened the viewing path near Mason and Finn's enclosure to small groups. There were waivers to sign and safety briefings to give. Donna had double-checked every line of their liability coverage, sat through meetings with their insurance agent about home insurance on the buildings and health insurance for the staff, things she used to resent but now saw as fences of another sort, necessary protections. One of the first regulars was Harold Bennett. He came by himself the first time, a cap in his hands, his Vietnam veteran's pin catching the light. Grace walked with him down the path, speaking softly. "That him, Harold asked when he saw Mason stretched in the shade and Finn trotting along the fence line. "That's them," Grace said, "Mason and Finn." Harold stood a long time without talking. Finally he said, "I had a voice once, lost it for a while. My grandson, well, he didn't care, climbed up anyway." He nodded toward Finn. "Looks like somebody else did the same thing here." Word of the tours spread slowly, not in flashy headlines, but in phone calls between friends, in articles in local papers, in online groups where people talked about second chances and trauma and why they kept old dogs and old cats even when a financial advisor might have told them to spend that money on their own retirement planning instead. Small donations came in with handwritten notes. Saw the video, it helped me on a hard day. Or, we're on a fixed income, but here's a little to help with meat and medicine. Donna watched the numbers. She saw that no single gift solved their problems, just as no single life insurance policy ever covered every surprise in a person's life. But together, those gifts formed a kind of safety net, enough to mend the worst fences, pay the vet bills, keep the lights on, and the water troughs full. Enough to say no firmly the next time a larger facility asked if Mason was available for transfer. "He's not available," she told Grace one evening, closing an email without answering it. "He's home." By then, Finn was splitting his days between worlds. In the mornings, staff opened the gates between yards so he could join Blaze, Nova, and the younger lions in a larger run. There, he learned to stalk a rolling drum like prey, to shove and wrestle without meaning harm, to read the flick of an ear or the sweep of a tail the way people read the tone of a voice. Mason watched the first introductions from the higher ground, heart in his throat. Every instinct screamed to step between Finn and the others, to keep him in the smaller circle where nothing bad ever happened. But each time the gates opened, Finn would glance back only once before trotting off, drawn by some deep call to join his own kind. So Mason did the hardest thing a parent, or anyone who has ever guarded something precious, can do. He stayed back. He watched as Blaze cuffed Finn in a rough game, and as Nova batted him down when he got too pushy, teaching him the unspoken rules. He watched Finn learn how to fall and shake it off, how to yield and then try again. When the play got too wild, Mason would rise and move closer, a silent line the others didn't cross. Over time, they didn't need the reminder as often. Finn was finding his feet. Every afternoon, when the younger lions tired and flopped into separate scraps of shade, Finn would wander back through the connecting gate, mane dusty, eyes bright. Without fail, he ended his day draped across Mason's paws, or stretched along his side, or with his head wedged under Mason's jaw, as if he still fit there the way he had as a cub. Visitors loved those moments. From behind the glass, seniors in ball caps and soft cardigans pressed their hands to the rail. Some saw sons and grandsons. Some saw younger versions of themselves. "It's funny," as Harold said once, sitting beside Donna on the bench as a tour group drifted away. "Folks think the story is that the cub needed the old lion, but when you've lived a while, you can see it the other way, too." Donna nodded. "We almost lost him," she admitted. "On paper, he was a bad investment." "Good thing life isn't all paper," Harold replied. One late afternoon, when summer was starting to think about giving way to fall, the sky over the refuge turned the same gold as Mason's faded mane. The heat backed off just enough that the breeze felt kind. Somewhere near the parking lot, a couple from out of state talked quietly about their long drive, about gas prices and the pros and cons of RV life versus staying put and reviewing their home insurance. Another visitor typed a note into her phone, planning to ask her financial planner about leaving a small legacy gift to the refuge in her will. Down in the main yard, Finn climbed the low rise of earth that gave a view over the whole compound. He stood there a moment, chest out, mane ruffled by the wind. Mason hauled himself up more slowly to join him, joints not what they once were, but still strong enough to carry him to his son's side. For a few heartbeats they stood together, two silhouettes against the falling sun, one broad and solid, one tall and still filling out. Finn lifted his head and roared. It was a young lion's call, bright and bold, streaked with the confidence of a creature that had never been punished for being what he was. His voice rushed out over the refuge, bounced off the sheds and the water tanks, carried on down the dusty road toward town. When the echoes faded, He glanced sideways at Mason, a question in his eyes. Mason met his gaze. Once that expectant look would have frozen him. Once the fear of pain would have clamped his throat tight. Now he felt only the familiar weight of Finn's trust and the lesser weight of his own years. He drew in a breath that filled his chest the way a good, steady laugh does, and he let it go. The roar that came was not as long as the storm roar had been. Age had taken some of the sheer force from him, but it was true and full, a sound with no flinch in it, no apology. It braided itself with Finn's earlier call, another line of the same story written a little lower, a little rougher, and all the stronger for it. In the viewing shed, the small group of visitors went quiet. Someone reached for a hand without looking to see whose it was. Maria stood in the doorway, dish towel in her hands, smiling through eyes that shone. Ethan leaned with his forearms on the rail, feeling that same thin air feeling he'd had the night of the storm, when something larger than his job had brushed past him. Grace let the sound wash over her. For a moment, the grant, applications and medical records and endless to-do lists fell away. All she heard was a lion who had once been taught that his own voice meant suffering, now choosing to speak because someone smaller than him had once called him home without using any words at all. As the last echoes faded into the warm evening, Finn stepped closer and bumped his head against Mason's shoulder. Mason rumbled, low and content, and sank back down to rest. Finn followed, folding himself into the curve of his father's body the way he had from the beginning. The cameras kept rolling. The visitors drifted away to their cars and their lives, to their monthly budgets and health insurance premiums and supper plans. The refuge lights blinked on one by one. Crickets began their thin songs in the dry grass. In the end, there was no grand finale, no dramatic tragedy. There was simply a tired lion lying in the dust with the son who had chosen him, breathing in time, heart steady. He had been a lion who no longer roared, a ghost in his own skin until an orphan cub adopted him as its father and refused to believe that silence was his destiny. In teaching that cub how to be a lion, he had finally remembered how to be one himself. And in that quiet space between the last roar and the first star, both of them were exactly where they were meant to be. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Before you scroll away, tell me this. Do you believe a bond like theirs could really exist? If this story touched your heart, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might just remind you that sometimes the wild loves us back in ways we'll never forget.